Welcome back to the program. Let's go to our next panel. Joining me, a couple of our regulars, Labor MP Anne Ali and Liberal MP Tim Wilson. Thank you both for your time. We better start on APRA, the report card back today. And I tell you what, it's not a very good one. I might start with you on this, Tim Wilson. It's about as scathing as it gets. The question being asked pretty early on here is, what about the chairman, Wayne Byers? Given this talks about leadership lacking at APRA, should there be a question mark over his future?
Well, I think there already is for many people, and I think that's what's come out of this report. But while the report raises serious questions about the management team of APRA and a lot of criticism from the staff directed upward, really it's about the individual cases. I think the more critical thing is around the systemic changes that need to occur in APRA. And Graham Samuel, who is a Goldstein constituent, has done an outstanding job on this report, makes the point is that transparency is critical for APRA and its success, in particular with its relation to financial institutions, and I think those recommendations are particularly welcome.
But if you've got staff there worried that people above them are too cosy in the financial industry, doesn't that say something about Wayne Byers?
Well, this is why the focus on transparency is critical. So if you take the individual out of the circumstance and you look at the circumstances and the situation that anybody who was in the equivalent office was in, the issue around the cosy relationship between the regulator and some of the financial institutions is the real question and the real issue, not taking away. I mean, I don't want to sit in judgment or I'm not the judge, jury and executioner of a particular regulator. But the circumstances we can look at in a policy sense and say transparency is the best interest here, because that would stop anybody either being in a situation where they become too cosy or have become cosy in the past.
Anne Ali, it seems like the government's, well, they've already said they're going to adopt all the recommendations relevant to it. Will Labor be happy with these reforms? Do these deserve to be given a go and then assess whether they're all working?
Oh, certainly. I mean, Jim Chalmers came out today and said that Labor would support the broad direction of these recommendations. I think it's also important to note that this review is in the context of the recommendations made by the Haynes Royal Commission. And I'm inclined to agree with Tim on the matter of leadership here. There's a surprise for you, Tim. But I'm inclined to agree with him with regards to that, because I think what the Royal Commission exposed, and certainly what this review exposes, is a cultural issue and cultural and systemic issue. And I agree that I think that the main recommendations of this report are about systemic change.
The cosiness that was spoken about, does there need to be some way to look at the way someone from APRA could possibly move over into the industry, i.e. remove the incentive for them to be seen as a friend of whether it be a bank or a financial institution, whatever it might be?
I think that if you look at the report, it made a number of recommendations about the regulatory powers of APRA, finding that those regulatory powers have been stymied somewhat by cultural issues, but also by things like having their funding cut. So, you know, I would say, wait and let's have a look at the recommendations of the report. We've yet to give detailed consideration to those recommendations and have a look at what could be done better. But in general, the direction of those recommendations is broadly welcomed by Labor and also by APRA, I must say.
But any sort of restriction on the way, as I said, employees could move over, is that a possibility, or is that just always going to be a reality of this type of body?
I think we need to wait and see how APRA deals with those recommendations and what kind of structural change could be made to prevent this, at least perception of this in the future. But again, I would say that the best course of action is to take an approach where we look at the recommendations in much more detail before making any determinations on that.
Tim Wilson, Anne Ali did mention funding there. Has it ever been properly explained why $200 million was cut from APRA initially under a coalition government in the first 5 years?
Well, as you know, that was before I was elected, but I mean, there are always reviews around efficiency dividends and measures that are taken around regulators, but I don't think that's in the end the issue or the core of the issue of what's being discussed today, as Anne outlined, and I'm glad she agreed with me around cultural change. Now, part of the task with all regulators is what is the proportionate amount of money we need to spend, as well as the funds they might also raise in some circumstances from industry to be able to do their job. What we know is that there's been a clear focus, particularly post-Royal Commission, in making sure that both the powers, the legislative powers that are necessary are important. In addition to that, there needs to be the financial resources. But critical to that also is not just the issue around culture, but it's also around skills. And part of the task, and to go back to the question that was raised before, and part of the task for everybody is the best people to know broadly what happens inside financial institutions is actually people who have worked inside financial institutions, because there's often a difference between theory and practice. And I think that's part of the task that not just APRA, ASIC, others have to confront, is how they're going to do their roles, recognising that there's always going to be transportability between regulators and the industry that's perfected, and making sure that people are making the correct decisions, the ethical decisions, and the appropriate ones for the circumstances.
So there's no issue going
interest.
from one to the other, either way, in terms of someone within APRA and then going to a bank, or vice versa? You've got no issue there?
Well, no, it just raises a lot of questions around process and how in circumstances that can occur, because, you know, for most people, when they get a job, unsurprisingly, they use the knowledge, the skills and the capacity they've developed in their previous job to go on to the next job and for them to seek promotion. I mean, even people like yourself do that. Tom, you know, I don't know where you started at Sky, but you probably started in a different position. You've used that experience to graduate up the system, and then eventually maybe you'll follow David Spears to the ABC. But the point is, the same is also true for everybody else. The question is around the legal obligations and the responsibility those people take in exercising those duties. And if there, for instance, wants to be periods where you don't want people to work or delays, then you've got to have a discussion around how you manage that, because in the end people have got to do things like pay bills as well. So these are sorts of things that should be considered as part of the government's policy response, will be considered as part of the government's policy response, and will hopefully go on to inform comprehensive measures to improve the state of the financial system.
It's a bit of a complicated area, but I get what you're saying, so we'll see what happens then. For the record, I started off feeding videos into players, and that was about it. And I think some of our viewers
look where you are now.
I should never have progressed from there. But who knows?
Look at you getting career advice from Tim.
Well, I started on my Sky News, you know, doing various different segments as well when you were probably doing that. So look at where we've all come. And I don't want to comment on Anne's career progress. Hopefully it's been just as blossoming.
I think it's going pretty well. I might ask you, Anne Ali, just another topic actually. This is getting a bit of attention. A sample exam paper for Year 12 students in Victoria. Now, within this, it claimed as a fact that Israel has persecuted Arabs by demolishing their homes because, quote, they don't follow the Jewish religion. It's been withdrawn. Does it highlight any concerns about what teachers might be inserting into things around some pretty delicate politics?
Yeah, look, generally I think that our schools should be teaching young people the kinds of critical thinking skills that are going to be useful to them in the future, and in particular in future employment. And I think it's that we should be talking about controversial issues with young people and giving them the space to talk about that. At the same time, however, I think that when these controversial issues are discussed in the manner that they have been in this particular instance, that there needs to be some cognizance and some awareness of just how emotive those issues are, and some awareness of the nuances and the sensitivities involved. One of the things that piqued my interest with this particular one was that in that exam question, or in the paper, it also said that religious discrimination can lead to religious dogma and people becoming extremists. That kind of frustration aggression hypothesis has kind of been debunked in terrorism studies, and I would issue words of caution also about simplifying and oversimplification of some very, very complex issues. But I do think that we should be giving young people the opportunity to discuss controversial, often controversial and delicate issues in a manner that it increases their ability to undertake critical thinking skills and gives them opportunities to do that. we do need to be careful with some of them.
So the careful element there is how you deal with it. I mean, this topic could be broached, you would say, to do with Palestine, Israel, the Palestinian homes that have been demolished, for example, but you talk about what is a very difficult, complex and tension-riddled issue over there. How would that come up with a teacher? Should it be, I guess, in a sort of exam paper like that? Is it more about something we have an open discussion of?
I think there are various ways you could talk about it. I think there are ways that you could talk about it in terms of looking at it from a historical context. And look, I've discussed this issue, albeit at a university level, within the courses that I've taught, particularly around international relations and international security. It is a very important issue for international relations and international security students. So I think that, you know, you need to really discuss these kinds of contemporary issues within a historical context, because the Palestine-Israel issue has evolved over many, many years, and it's changed over those many years. So I would prefer it to be seen in a broader context.
Tim Wilson, your thoughts?
Well, talk about issues, sure. Brainwash, no. And one of the things with this paper is that it's clearly designed to demonise and stigmatise the state of Israel and, of course, Jewish people on the basis of alleging they have no tolerance for other people of other faiths, which is just complete rubbish. In fact, Israel is one of the countries that respects people's faith regardless of their tradition in the Middle East. And is, you know, there we go, we're going to extend the hand of bipartisanship. Anne is right, these things need to be talked about in a context. But the way you develop critical thinking skills isn't by giving people fait accomplis and conclusions. It's to present them with evidence and facts and for people to be able to assess and to make judgments. But I think the thing that's disturbing is to see this sort of content in the curriculum designed to lead young students' minds to conclusions, and quite clearly and deliberately so. And what was the motivation behind it? Now, we've had a spate of anti-Semitic attacks in Melbourne and Sydney and perhaps other parts of the country as well. And I think what people are concerned about, increasingly concerned about, is the rise of seemingly anti-Semitic agendas in the community generally. But then when you see it in now seeping into our curriculum, I think it raised a lot of eyebrows, including from myself, about whose priorities and what priorities being put forward before our kids.
Do we need to be careful about calling this, you know, part of an agenda, anything that was done deliberately? I guess once you get this type of topic involved
I think that's a question
there's always a chance that someone will have their own interpretation. I mean, this is one example that was eventually withdrawn. So, I mean, how widespread can we call this in this particular circumstance?
No, I'm not saying this is part of a systemic part of activity. I'm just saying there has been a lot of activity in Melbourne, in Sydney and other parts of the country. In fact, there's been quite a peak, I gave a speech about earlier in the year, on the actually quite disturbing and, you know, and I don't say this with any disrespect.
Some of the political graffiti, for example?
Yeah, political graffiti, anti-Semitic behaviour, and, you know, there's also content that's out there that is against Muslims as well, and we need to acknowledge that as well. And so just throwing this sort of content into the curriculum with, as I said, what seems to be foregone conclusions is the concern. And if there was a motivation behind it, or there hasn't been a full credentialing of the content that's being put to our kids, people have every right to ask very serious questions.
I just want to get you both very quickly on the situation with the Uyghur Muslims. How far, Anne Ali, should the Australian government be willing to push this issue with China in a broad sense and around the Australian citizens as well?
Oh, look, it really is a heartbreaking situation, and I've heard stories from Uyghurs who are here in Australia who have not seen family members who have gone over to China and have been interned in these terrible camps. Australia, I think, needs to be very, very vocal about this. We as a country cannot tolerate this kind of persecution from another country. And I don't think we're speaking out about it enough. I don't think there's enough awareness of it. It's
what hasn't happened enough? What should be said beyond what has been said, specifically?
Well, I'm not privy to what's been said directly between our Minister for Foreign Affairs and the government.
Doesn't
of China,
that make it hard to
for
say
example.
it's not being enough then?
Well, I think there needs to be more public awareness and more public statements about how we can't tolerate this kind of behaviour from China, particularly where it affects Australian citizens, as it is now.
Tim Wilson, the words are being used. They don't appear to be working. How far should we be willing to go here? What's next?
Well, I think we need to clarify, and I've spoken, to the Minister about this before because it's a concern to myself. And of course, like with a lot of issues where we have tensions with other countries, we have the below-the-surface diplomatic activity, and that's definitely, always ongoing on issues like this. And then, in the past week, we've actually, signed letters working with other countries. So, as you know, and Anne knows, we're not going to solve this issue by itself. We have to work with a community of nations to put pressure on China. But, I make no ambiguity about what I think is a horrific situation. But it doesn't sit in isolation. China has a long history, frankly, of seeking to re-educate populations within their sphere to conform to some traditional standards. There's certainly been some increasing flashpoints in China, and you may have seen in Hong Kong in recent weeks. And we need to be firm and resolute in defence of people's freedoms and freedom to choose how to live their lives. But to be frank, that's the Australian way. I wouldn't automatically say that was the Chinese way.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say it's not given the response from Chinese state media saying the Uyghur Muslims are happy, even though they won't release them, nor let anyone in there from the media. Tim Wilson, Anne Ali, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Very, very agreeing one today. Lots of agreement there.
It was. We had agreement, we had career advice, we had it all. We'll do it in a fortnight's time.